Good evening, one and all. Welcome to this webinar session hosted by Torrent Pharma. Today, I, Gitesh Nayak from the marketing team of Torrent Pharma, take this opportunity to introduce before you Dr. Janani Shankar, Senior Consultant Pediatrician and Hematologist from Chennai City, a renowned name in the pediatric specialty. As she has authored chapters in various pediatric textbooks, she has her name associated with more than 60 publications in national and international index journals. She was the WHO consultant for revised dengue management guideline and national convener for PALS from 2009 to 2011. Today, she will be speaking on the topic challenging cases in pediatrics and the lessons learned. Before I hand over the dais to Dr. Janani Shankar, for all the learned audience who have any queries during the course of the webinar, can type in their queries in the comment section on their screen. The doctor will be attending to the relevant queries after her presentation. Over to you, Dr. Janani.
Yeah. Thank you, Torrent Pharmaceuticals, for this opportunity. Children with, all cases in pediatrics are challenging to diagnose. It's not easy because, unlike adults, you don't get them to narrate their problems. You have to rely on the parents and sometimes the guardians or grandparents to get a proper history and then diagnose them. So I'll be going through the next half an hour to 45 minutes, just run through some of the challenging cases where we had difficulties in diagnosing them. Of course, we arrived at a proper diagnosis, but what are the challenges that we had in diagnosing them and what are the lessons that we learned from each of the cases? That's what I will be discussing. So when you look at the first case, it's a 13-year-old previously well adolescent girl who presented with high-grade intermittent fever with excessive sweating and effervescence for almost 1 month. There was no other history of pallor or abdominal distension, bleeds, joint pain, cough, loss of appetite, loss of weight, nothing, no red flags in the history, and there was no history of contact with tuberculosis. On examination, she was a thinly built girl weighing about 40 kgs. There was no pallor, icterus, edema, or rash. The joints were normal. There were a few enlarged, mobile, non-tender bilateral cervical nodes, and there was no organomegaly. The baseline investigations, except for the raised ESR and SGOT of around 80 and albumin of 3.7, we didn't have much clue from the baseline investigations. Her X-ray, as you can see, showed a node here, the mediastinal node. Mantle was 20 millimeters positive, and ultrasound abdomen showed numerous enlarged mesenteric, portahepatic, bilateral iliac group of nodes. So we went ahead and did the fasting gastric aspirate gene expert, which came as negative. Laparoscopic lymph node biopsy was done, and lymph node expert MTB and tuberculosis, Mycobacterium tuberculosis was detected and it was sensitive to rifampicin. Lymph node histopathology also revealed acaciating granuloma. She was started on category 1 ATT and fever settled, and she's on regular follow-up and presently on. This is like long time back I prepared these slides, but currently she's completed the treatment and she's doing well. So she was a newly diagnosed, microbiologically confirmed, disseminated tuberculosis. So the dilemma that we had in this child was mediastinal node and multiple abdominal nodes. So there was the surgeon who went ahead and did a laparoscopic biopsy. She actually did a laparoscopy and biopsy. She was actually very confident that it was a lymphoma and not tuberculosis. But thanks, to our surprise, it turned out to be tuberculosis because Manto was also positive. So chronic infections like tuberculosis can present as fever of unknown origin. TB and lymphoma can mimic each other. We cannot start empirical ATT if Suppose based on the mantle positivity and the nodes on the mediastinum and the abdomen, if we had started on ATT without getting the expert positive, I think we may be wrong. Sometimes what happens, you treat it as tuberculosis and finally it may be a lymphoma. So obtain tissue diagnosis wherever possible and do not start on empirical ATT. That's the message from this child. Moving on to the next case. 7-year-old boy presented with fever of 2 months duration and arthralgia involving the left ankle of 3 days duration. He was febrile, had mild pallor, no significant lymphadenopathy, skin, eyes, and joints were normal, and he had a mild hepatosplenomegaly. So the possibilities that we had in mind, again, 2 months fever, arthralgia. So always infection run through our mind, malaria, typhoid, scrub, brucella, inflammatory disorder, as well as malignancy. These were our working diagnoses. Baseline investigations had a lymphocytic predominance. Platelets were on the borderline 1.2 lakhs. There was mild elevation of SGOT and SGPT. Otherwise, all the cultures and everything was negative. Bone marrow examination, because it was a 2 months fever, we had to do a bone marrow examination. Bone marrow was a reactive marrow. Bone marrow culture group, Brucella melitensis. So the final diagnosis was brucellosis. So retrospectively, when we went into the history, we found that there was a history of ingestion of unpasteurized milk. So history is again very, very important, and bone marrow is again important. If you look at the next scenario, 9-year-old boy, fever of 3 weeks duration, abdominal distension of 1 week, breathing difficulty of 2 days duration. He was febrile, tachypnic, had mild pallor, generalized lymphadenopathy. Joints were normal, and he had moderate hepatosplenomegaly. Baseline investigations, again, counts were slightly on the higher side, polymorph predominance. SGOT and SGPT were on the higher side. And chest X-ray showed bilateral diffuse infiltrates. Ultrasound had some hepatosplenomegaly, and there were some hypoechoic lesions in the liver and spleen, and bone marrow was a reactive marrow. So again, this is a child with fever, lymphadenopathy, hepatosplenomegaly, pneumonia, microabscesses in the liver and spleen. There is no evidence of malignancy. Again, it looks like more like an infection. Bone marrow culture again came as Burkholderia pseudomallei, so melioidosis. So the final diagnosis was melioidosis. Scenario 4, 11-year-old girl, previously well, developmentally normal. She had a painful swelling in the left gluteal region with limping gait of almost 20 days duration. There was fever of 20 days duration. A week later, she developed weakness of both the lower limbs. Her counts were on the higher side, ESR was high. Because she had a swelling and painful swelling in the gluteal region, MRI was done, which showed a fluid-filled lesion with sinus tract over the gluteal region. So left gluteal abscess IND was done, and she had continued to have prolonged fever and acute onset paraparesis followed by encephalopathy. This was the time she was referred to our hospital. At admission, the possibilities that we considered was meningoencephalitis with para-infectious demyelination, cold abscess in the left gluteal region with CNS involvement, or an evolving GBS. So if you look at the counts done at our hospital, again a very high total count with polymorphs predominant. CRP and ESR were on the higher side. Mantle was negative and chest X-ray was normal. CSF was done because she had neurological involvement. It again had a lymphocytic pleocytosis with a low sugar and a high protein. However, the cultures were sterile, and the AFB smear and expert MTB of the CSF was negative. MRI showed features suggestive of acute demyelinating encephalomyelitis. So this was the MRI. You can see the flare hyperintensity with multiple restricted diffusion in the bilateral. Yes, these are the flare in the frontoparietal cortex. and also a non-enhancing T2 weighted hyperintensity from C1 to, you can see, C1 to conus, she had a hyperintensity. So features were suggestive of Adam again. So we involved the neurologist, the ID specialist, the radiologist, started on pulse MPS, broad spectrum antibiotics to cover all possible organisms, and also started on empirical antituberculous drugs because it started off with an abscess and then involved the neurological system. So she developed new worsening lesions in the brain. The spine lesion had resolved. High inflammatory markers persisted. Persisting fever, lymphocytic pleocytosis with high protein. All the cultures, CSF culture, blood culture, urine cultures were sterile. And we also went ahead and investigated her for fungal infections. It came as negative. CSF ADA was normal. She worked up for autoimmune encephalitis, rare infections like Brucella, Mycoplasma, Toxoplasma, everything was negative. Further workup showed a raised LDH and immunoglobulin profile was normal, HIV was negative. Flow cytometry to rule out underlying immune deficiency was normal. Nitroglutetrazoleum test to rule out chronic granulomatous disease was negative. ANA was negative. And the bone marrow aspirate showed reactive marrow with myeloid hyperplasia. So worsening demyelination, persisting infection, unusual organism, these were the things that was running through our mind. She's already received the course of methylprednisolone. What now? Whether we have to give IVIG, plasmapheresis. We went ahead and did IVIG, gave IVIG, and plasmapheresis also was done. Antibiotics were de-escalated to ceftriaxone. ATT was continued. Amphotericin and cotrimoxazole was added. After 4 cycles of plasmapheresis in the ICU, fever spikes were still persisting. No improvement in sensorium, no improvement in the fever. So we were caught at the crossroads. What next? Whether to continue plasmapheresis, stop plasmapheresis and continue antibiotic, antifungal or ATT to continue, whether to repeat imaging, we were stuck here. So we went ahead and after a lot of discussion with the intensive care unit people, the neurologist, the neurosurgeon, we went ahead and repeated the MRI, which showed numerous small ring, nodular ring enhancing lesions in bilateral cerebral hemispheres, parenchyma, cortical sulci. You can see these multiple lesions. Midbrain, middle cerebellar peduncles and cerebellum. So we had to convince our neurosurgeon to do a USG guided brain biopsy. So to our surprise, again, Burkholderia pseudomallei was the report that we got from the brain biopsy culture. So again, it was a case of neuromyeliosis. She improved with parenteral ceftazidime and trimethoprim sulfamethoxazole for 2 weeks. This was the treatment that is normally given for a child with myeliosis. There was dramatic improvement in sensorium and weakness, and the temperature touched normal for the first time. She was discharged on oral cotrimoxazole and doxycycline. She's doing well on follow-up. The next scenario, again a 10-year-old girl, previously well and developmentally normal. She had documented fever on and off for 3 months. Intermittent high-grade fever with neck pain for 5 days. There was a weight loss of around 3 kgs in the last 3 months. However, it was not associated with any red flags like cough, headache, oral ulcers, skin rash, joint swelling, bone pain, no contact with animals, no recent travel, no contact with tuberculosis. Clinical examination, she was febrile, she had bilateral firm, mobile, non-tender, significant upper deep and posterior cervical adenopathy. There was no pallor, no bleeds, no other significant adenopathy. Systemic examination showed a mild hepatosplenomegaly. So again, these 3 went through our minds: infection, inflammation, and neoplasm, because 3 months of fever, almost 2 months of fever with around 3 kg weight loss and nodes which were significant. So again, investigations didn't help us much except for a mild elevated ESR. Otherwise, everything was normal. Persisting fever, ESR was going up, but again, nothing else from the other investigations. This was a temperature chart. So we went ahead and did second line investigations. Matter was negative, HIV was negative, ANA was negative, echo was normal, bone marrow aspirate, reactive marrow, bone marrow culture, there was sterile. So we thought the only thing that is left behind is the cervical node. So we decided to do a biopsy of the cervical node. So we did a cervical node biopsy. Histopathology again came as reactive adenitis. Again, lymph node expert MTB was negative. The sensitivity of tissue for expert MTB is very high. So when it comes negative, we cannot still call it as tuberculosis. So we were wondering whether some atypical organism which is causing a node, and it was not malignancy, it was not tuberculosis, what else is it? So what we did was we sent the sample for IgM brucella. And we were so desperate and we started her on doxycycline. And to our surprise, the fever spikes touched normal. And we again probed the child and the mother. Then the mother came out with a history of giving goat's milk. Someone said that child will grow well and the immunity will improve if she drinks goat's milk. So went ahead and gave her, goat's milk was given by the mother to the child, and this she did not think was significant for us to tell. Of course, I think we probed her and asked unpasteurized milk. Initially, she refused, and later on, she came out with this history. So we went ahead and sent brucella antibodies, IgM, which was highly positive. 1:68 was the dilution that we got, and she improved with doxycycline. So if you look at the lessons learned from scenario 2, 3, 4, and 5, all were zoonotic infections. So one should keep in mind zoonotic infections when you have a prolonged febrile illness. Proper history of animal exposure is important, and a high index of suspicion is needed for early diagnosis. Zoonotic infections and other rare infections like brucellosis and milioidosis are important causes of FUO. You can see we had 2 milioidosis and 2 brucellosis. Both of them presented only with fever of unknown origin, but we didn't have much clue initially. But later on, of course, we were able to strike at the diagnosis, either with a bone marrow culture in 2 cases or a tissue biopsy and culture. In one child, we had to do a brain biopsy and culture. In the other child, though the lymph node biopsy came as negative, the serological test, brucella IgM, gave us the clue to diagnosis. So one should keep in mind zoonotic infections and make use of bone marrow culture, because bone marrow culture is something that is underutilized. That's what I would say. Bone marrow smear study is done for a child with prolonged fever, but bone marrow cultures are not done. So bone marrow culture is very, very important and very useful when you have a child with prolonged fever. So that brings us to the next case. This is a sixth scenario. Is a 5-month-old infant, had bilateral neck swelling of 2 months duration, which was progressively increasing. Also had intermittent fever of 20 days duration. Again, the child was managed elsewhere. They had done a Manto, which was negative, chest X-ray, which was normal. They had done a fine needle aspiration biopsy of the cervical node, which was reported as mycobacterial infection. And the child was started on ATT. After almost 2 weeks to 3 weeks of ATT, there was absolutely no improvement. Had persisting fever and lymphadenopathy, and hence the child was referred by the primary pediatrician to us. When we saw the child and examined, a well-nourished child who was febrile with no pallor, no bleeds, had significant cervical and axillary adenopathy, had also a mild hepatomegaly. Hemoglobin was around 6.4 and the platelet count was high. ESR was again 60. Other investigations were normal. So what we did was, because the FNAC did not show that it was tuberculosis and there was no improvement with ATT, we went ahead and did an excision biopsy of the axillary node, which was quite a significant node that was there. To our surprise, we found the histopathology and the immunohistochemistry suggesting Langerhans cell histiocytosis. So we went ahead and did a bone marrow and skeletal survey to stage the child. When you have a child with LCH, you need staging before starting chemotherapy. So we went ahead and did bone marrow. Bone marrow was normal. Skeletal survey was had some light lesions. So staging was done and started on chemotherapy. The child has completed therapy and the cervical nodes and everything has resolved absolutely, and child is doing really well. So that was Langerhans cell histiocytosis. So the lessons learned again, don't rely on FNAC if it doesn't work. If it works and the child improves, fine. If the FNAC shows some diagnosis and if your child is not improving, I think you should go ahead with excision biopsy, which also gives a macroscopic appearance of the node can be seen, and the histopathology also can be done in a better manner. Moving on to the next scenario, 7 months old male infant presented with cough and fever of 1 month duration, also had loose stools of 20 days duration and a skin rash of 10 days duration. So if you see, it's a male, 7 months old male with significant history of fever. There's a two system involvement, the respiratory system as well as the GI system, also has a skin rash. A very sick looking child who was febrile, tachypnic. There was a BCG scar which was present because we wanted to rule out tuberculosis. Multiple discrete nodules over the arms, thighs, and trunk were present. Had a cellulitis over the right thigh. Chest was clear and had a mild hepatosplenomegaly. The baseline workup showed, if you can see here, the striking thing is the lymphopenia in this child. So, a lymphocyte count of 4 in a child who's less than a year is something that is alarming. And a hemoglobin which is low, an OT which was high. Chest X-ray showed atelectasis of the left lower lobe, and ultrasound showed mild hepatosplenomegaly. Blood and urine culture did not grow anything, and the gastric juice for expert MTB was positive. So HIV ELISA was non-reactive. If you look at the immunoglobulin levels, all were on the lower side. And flow cytometry for T and B cell markers was suggestive of severe combined immune deficiency. Child was counseled regarding stem cell transplantation, started on ATT and cotrimoxazole prophylaxis. So you have a child who's less than 1 year, presenting with significant involvement of more than one system, lymphopenia and the blood counts, involvement of more than 2 or 3 systems in the investigations and the clinical history. I think you should think of immunoglobulin immune deficiency. Go ahead and get all the T cell and the B cell markers flow cytometry done. So it was a child with SCID. So the lessons learned are unusual, chronic, recurrent, serious infections always screen for immune deficiency. Lymphopenia is an important diagnostic clue for immune deficiency. Coming to the next scenario, is it okay? Should I continue or? Amit and Gitesh, should I continue?
Yes, ma'am. Hello.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Is it okay? I will continue. Okay.
Yeah. All good, ma'am.
Okay, fine. So coming to the next scenario, it was an 8 months old male infant, previously well developmentally normal, presented with high-grade fever of 3 days duration and erythematous rash of 1 day duration. So the only thing is this high-grade fever and rash. So febrile 105 degree Fahrenheit, very irritable child, diffuse erythematous rash over the face and trunk, no conjunctival congestion or enanthem, no lymphadenopathy, joints were normal, vital parameters were stable, systemic examination was normal. So the possibilities that we had in mind was viral exanthematous illness because child had high-grade fever with the rash, and we went ahead and investigated the child. Investigations were, except for an elevated liver enzymes and accounts which were on the slightly on the higher side, we didn't have much clues. So treated symptomatically with IV fluids and paracetamol. This is the temperature chart of the child. High-grade fever persisting. So we were wondering, initial impression was viral, so we didn't want to go on waiting thinking that it is viral because it's a very small infant. We repeated the CBC, CRP and blood culture. CRP was high, ESR was high. So we thought we should not wait further. Albumin is again an acute phase reactant. So it's an inflammatory marker. Albumin was low and SGPT was on the higher side. Chest X-ray was normal. So we sent blood cultures on third generation cephalosporin. 12 hours later, child went into signs of compensated shock, requiring a crystalloid bolus. So we thought of toxic shock syndrome. So we added vancomycin and clindamycin and shifted to PICU. This is to cover other organisms like MRSA and MSSA. In the PICU, child required further fluid bolus of 30 ml per kg. There was no further deterioration. And the child was hemodynamically stable for almost 24 hours and the child was transferred to the ward. In the ward, again, the child had persisting high-grade fever, though the hemodynamic parameters returned to normal. You can see the temperature chart. Though on broad-spectrum antibiotics, child continues to have high-grade fever, developed edema of the hands and feet. Blood culture was sterile. Repeat investigations showed a thrombocytopenia, rising ESR and CRP, and a fall in hemoglobin 2. So when you look at the summary, it's a child with fever of almost more than 5 days, an infant actually, with rash and edema of extremities, high inflammatory markers, low hemoglobin, decreasing platelet count, low albumin, and mildly high transaminases. So are we dealing with incomplete Kawasaki or is it a post-viral HLH? Because initially the impression was viral xanthimatous illness. So are we dealing with a post-viral HLH or an incomplete Kawasaki? So we went ahead and did the second line investigations. The ferritin and fibrinogen were normal. Echo showed normal coronaries, no effusion. So we stuck with the diagnosis of incomplete Kawasaki because in infants, you don't have to have an involvement of the coronaries to label them as incomplete Kawasaki. If you've ruled out infections and if you have sterile cultures or sterile and you have high inflammatory markers in an infant with high-grade fever, you still think of incomplete Kawasaki. So we went ahead and gave IVIG 2 grams per kg and aspirin 35 mg per kg per day. So as you can see the temperature chart, the fever just touched normal after starting IVIG. Clinical well-being improved and discharged on antiplatelet dose of aspirin. So on follow-up, the child was asymptomatic, and as you can see, any child who has Kawasaki follow-up, they have desquamation of the skin, periannual desquamation. So this child also had desquamation. 2 weeks later, the platelets went up to 7.63 lakhs as expected. ESR was still high. This high ESR is secondary to the IVIG that you give. So usually IVIG causes a rise in ESR. So we were not alarmed by that. Echo, we repeated 2 weeks later, that was still normal. 4 weeks later, the platelets returned to normal and ESR also returned to normal. So we changed to antiplatelet dose of aspirin. So incomplete Kawasaki, as I mentioned, persisting fever, less than 4 of the 5 clinical criteria. So this child was incomplete Kawasaki disease, rather an unusual presentation, mimicking a toxic shock syndrome and requiring ICU admission and presentation as slipping into something like a shock-like syndrome. So this is the algorithm that's given in the Nelson textbook of pediatrics. So you have, these are the supplemental lab criteria in an infant with fever without focus, low albumin, anemia, elevation of acute phase reactants, platelet count, which is less, and then after 7 days increasing, WBC count, which is high, and urine WBC, sterile pyuria. So it was consistent with incomplete Kawasaki. So a high index of clinical suspicion is needed to diagnose incomplete Kawasaki disease. Some infants can present with thrombocytopenia leading to delayed diagnosis and poor prognosis. ESR may remain elevated for weeks And it may be the effect of IVIG. I don't think you should get worried and start thinking whether the inflammation is still persisting and whether child needs another dose of IVIG or steroids. Coming to the next scenario, 10 months old infant, fever with skin rash of almost 1.5 months duration. Febrile, had a rash over palms and soles, no lymphadenopathy, no organomegaly. So the two significant symptoms were only fever and rash. So you can see the rash, palmar plantar rash, which was very, very characteristic. We went ahead and investigated this child. We didn't have much clue except the ESR was high. The cultures were sterile. Bone marrow was a reactive marrow. Baseline immunoglobulin profile showed a high IgG, and HIV alpha was non-reactive. So the red flags in this child was a low hemoglobin, a low platelet count, a negative CRP, and a high ESR, and hyper IgG. So these are all clues that will point out to an inflammatory disorder. So we went ahead and lupus was in our mind because CRP negative and ESR high, and by cytopenia we thought of lupus. So we went ahead and did a direct Coombs test, which was positive. ANA was strongly positive. dsDNA was negative, but Smith IG and UNRNP was strongly positive, which pointed towards monogenic lupus. So the diagnosis was monogenic lupus. So the lessons learned in this child was connective tissue disease and vasculitis is an important cause of pyrexia of unknown origin. These should be kept in mind. Once it persists and you've ruled out all infections, both typical and atypical, I think you cannot go on changing antibiotics. You should think of inflammatory disorder. Varied clinical presentation and multi-system involvement is classical of an inflammatory disorder. A negative CRP is an important diagnostic clue, and ANA is a recommended screening test. If ANA becomes positive, then you can go ahead and do specific tests. Coming to the next scenario, it's a 1.5-year-old male toddler. Fever on and off for 2 months, almost 2 months this child had fever. Admitted twice at 2 different hospitals for documented low counts, treated as enteric fever and dengue fever in 2 different hospitals. Presented to us with fever of almost 10 days associated with chills and rigors. On examination, child was well thriving, active and playful, had pallor, no bleeds. Pallor was significant, had a firm hepatosplenomegaly, no significant lymphadenopathy. So if you can see the hemoglobin is low, the platelets, it's a pancytopenia. All the 3 lineages were depressed. Cultures were sterile. Peripheral smear showed pancytopenia with numerous ring forms and trophozoites of vivax and multiple ring forms of falciparum 2. We were really thrilled. Admitted in 2 hospitals, treated as enteric, treated as dengue. So we have diagnosed by both malaria, vivax and falciparum. So we were happy that we made a diagnosis and we could explain all the lab parameters and the clinical symptoms based on this vivax and falciparum being positive. So we went ahead and mixed malaria with severe pancytopenia was our diagnosis. So we went ahead and started the child on artemether lumefantrine combination. Artemether lumefantrine combination and started on primaquine. G6PD levels were normal, so we went ahead and gave primaquine. Child became afebrile. There was no malarial parasite on the smear on day 3. So we were happy and we discharged the child on iron supplements and primaquine. This is the temperature chart which improved after artemether lumefantrine. 2 weeks later, we wanted the child to have a documented normal counts. So we called the child for review and 2 weeks later, the child was afebrile, clinically well, but had persisting pancytopenia. There was no malarial parasite on the peripheral smear. I was advised a week review a week later with CBC. So recurrence of fever spikes, firm hepatosplenomegaly, persisting pancytopenia. So if you look at the serial labs, the pancytopenia was persisting, but the malarial parasite had disappeared. So you're wondering what's wrong. There's no parasite, but the pancytopenia is persisting. Something else is there which we are missing. So we worked up for HLH, which was negative. Bone marrow we did was aparticular, hypocellular. Bone marrow biopsy was done. This was the two times bone marrow was attempted. It was hypocellular, and the third time we went ahead and did a bone marrow biopsy, which was consistent with acute leukemia. So it was an acute lymphoblastic leukemia, on top of which the child had malaria. So it's persisting fever with cytopenia, possible infection considered secondary. Can I hide this? So persisting fever with cytopenia post-infection, consider secondary HLH, consider alternative diagnosis, and workup for pancytopenia. Always bone marrow biopsy is preferred over aspiration, because this child bone marrow aspiration was negative and biopsy gave us the diagnosis of acute lymphoblastic leukemia. So this child had two problems. One is acute lymphoblastic leukemia, which was causing the pancytopenia. On top of that, child had malaria. Coming to the next scenario, 6-year-old girl with fever of 2 months duration, bilateral neck swelling of 2 months, progressively increasing. There was no history of abdominal distension or bleeds or joint pain or chronic cough, no red flags at all. Like you had seen the other cases, this is a thorough exercise that we do for any child with prolonged fever. So everything was negative. There was no history of contact with tuberculosis. On examination, child was febrile, had generalized lymphadenopathy, no pallor, no bleeds, mild hepatomegaly. The labs again showed bicytopenia. Total count was low and we could count only 50 cells, but the hemoglobin and the platelet count was normal. So child had leukopenia alone. Significant leukopenia, mildly elevated LDH and SGOT. Uric acid was slightly on the higher side. The other workup were negative. Bone marrow was normal, chest X-ray was normal, mantle was negative, ultrasound abdomen was normal, and EBV, VCA, IgM was negative. So because the child had generalized lymphadenopathy with fever and leukopenia, our working diagnosis was infectious mononucleosis. So EBV, VCA, IgM was negative. So we did a cervical lymph node biopsy because the duration of fever was very long and EBV was negative. So the histopathology and immunohistochemistry came as histiocytic necrotizing lymphadenitis, which is called Kikuchi disease. So the final diagnosis was Kikuchi disease. So prolonged fever with lymphadenopathy, you should consider infections, malignancy, and inflammatory disorder. Kikuchi comes under an inflammatory disorder, or sometimes it can also be a forerunner for malignancy. So if the baseline investigations are normal, and lymph node biopsy should be considered in evaluation of such children. Coming to the next scenario, 2-year-old boy with fever of almost 1.5 months duration with a skin rash of 1 month duration. Sick-looking child, febrile, no pallor or bleeds, had generalized lymphadenopathy, generalized erythema, mild hepatosplenomegaly. Counts were on the higher side. Albumin was low. SGOT, SGPT was on the higher side. All the blood culture, the Brucella IgM, EBV, VCA IgM, everything was negative HIV. No clues from the acute phase reactants either. Echo was normal, ferritin was normal, ANA was negative. Bone marrow just showed a reactive marrow with tri-lineage hematopoiesis. Retrospective history, complex febrile seizure 2 months back, started on phenobarbital and valproate at native place. So we made a diagnosis of DRESS, which is drug rash, dysnophilia, and systemic symptoms. So we went ahead and did a skin biopsy because the skin lesions were quite extensive, which showed lymphocytic infiltrates in the dermal epidermal junction with lymphocytic exocytosis, perivascular and perifollicular lymphocytic infiltration, which is characteristic of DRESS. So this child, the offending drugs, the anticonvulsants were stopped and the child was started on steroids. The child improved dramatically and the rashes subsided and the fever also improved. So in any child with FUO presenting with fever, rash, lymphadenopathy with visceral involvement, drug hypersensitivity should be considered as a differential diagnosis. And you have to really probe them and get the history, because unless you probe them, you may not get the history of drugs, because they may not think it as important to tell, because the other thing is, though the drug DRESS, the characteristic thing is eosinophilia for diagnosis. Eosinophilia may be absent in the initial stages. Between 10 to 50% of children may not have eosinophilia in the initial stages. So I think that was the last case. So if we had gone through 12 cases of fever, the initial 5 cases were infections. The other 7 cases were inflammatory disorders and malignancies. So if you can see the order in which we should think of in a child with prolonged fever is infections, rheumatological diseases, neoplasms, granulomatous diseases, and then the miscellaneous. And it's a diagnostic challenge. Like any child who comes to you with more than a month fever or more than 3 weeks of fever without any clue from the baseline investigations, it is a diagnostic challenge. Most of the time you diagnose by getting a detailed history. Go back, probe and get all possible history. Do a meticulous physical examination. Don't miss any system. Strip the child and examine for a rash, for a node, for something that will give you a clue. An erythema nodosum, an oral ulcer, an ulcer in the hard palate, a deep ulcer in the hard palate. Anything can give you a clue towards the diagnosis. Basic lab tests, don't ignore baseline lab tests. Go back and have a look at the peripheral smear. Peripheral smear examination, meticulous examination of the peripheral smear by yourself or by the experienced pathologist is important. Targeted lab tests have to be ordered. Don't order all tests at one go. You have something in mind, you target those investigations and order the lab tests pertaining to that particular diagnosis and treat accordingly. So, history. So, document the temperature, the duration, the specific pattern of fever. These are all important. Clinical well-being during the afebrile period, that's again a very important clue. A child with some atypical infection or an inflammatory disorder will be very well during the afebrile period, unlike a child with malignancy who will remain sick even during the afebrile period. Look at the response to antipyretic. Look at constitutional symptoms like weight loss, sweating, myalgia, headache. These things will give you a clue. Other associated symptoms also have to be given importance to. Give a lot of importance to travel history, because Krupp typhus infections usually diagnosed with travel history. Drug history is very, very important, as in the case of DRESS that you saw. Contact with animals, ingestion of raw milk, any recent surgical procedure is again very, very important, because sometimes after an appendicectomy, what happens is an appendicolith can migrate and pierce the diaphragm and can cause a persistent pneumonia, which will not respond to antibiotics unless you go ahead, explore and remove the appendicolith. Contact history is very, very important. Examination, again, meticulous physical examination. Look for rash, petechiae, purpura, seborrhea, sparse hair sweating. Each finding will give you a clue. Eyes, again, it's a window to your diagnosis. Conjunctivitis, bleeds, phlyctin, uveitis, choroid tubercles. Oropharynx, nose and ears, again. Go ahead and good examination of the oral cavity of the dental system. lymph nodes. You have to strip and examine all the lymph nodes, including the epitrochlear node. Specific system examination. Do a good musculoskeletal examination. Do a decals if possible. Basic investigations, as I mentioned, are very, very important. Targeted lab tests. To conclude, FUO is always a diagnostic challenge. A detailed history and meticulous physical examination is very important. Systematic approach is always helpful. Do not jump and do order all investigations and start all. We've seen prescriptions where they give antibiotics, antiviral, anti-malarial, antifungal, everything at one go, and sometimes even steroids and ATT also. So do not do that. Always try to arrive at a diagnosis through a systematic approach. That will be more helpful. So I conclude by saying that for diagnosing any challenging case, like you need how important it is to have 2 eyes and 2 hands. You also need 2 brains. So the one on my left is right is Dr. Venkateshwari. She's my assistant, and both the brains were involved in diagnosing most of these children. Thank you. Yeah.
Thank you so much, ma'am. We'll invite Mr. Gitesh for the vote of thanks.
Yeah. There are questions. Some questions, or should I answer them? Hello?
Yes, ma'am. He said we can take the questions.
Yeah. 1 minute. Let me say. Excellent. Okay. Just a query. How do you explain BCG scar in the infant with skid that was presented? Would expect it to be absent. No, it may not be absent. You can have a disseminated BCGosis. Dr. Rishikesh Dingankar, BCG scar will be present, but it can cause disseminated BCGosis. So BCG scar will be present. All our cases of good academic, thanks to madam. Okay. How long we should give aspirin in Kawasaki disease? Inflammatory dose, you give it till the inflammatory markers come down. The ESR and CRP and the platelet count, you have a follow-up repeat. And once the ESR, CRP and platelet count return to normal, you can go to the antiplatelet dose. Once the ESR and CRP come to normal, you can go to the antiplatelet dose. Usually the duration is up to 6 weeks. With enoxaparin useful in pediatric COVID, madam. I don't have much experience with pediatric COVID. So far, we've had about 25 patients with pediatric COVID, but 5 of them had something like an inflammatory syndrome, but the others, all of them were asymptomatic and they improved very well. So my experience with that was very, very limited. Fever, sore throat, and conjunctivitis, probably. What precautions? Oh, the question thing got lost. Yeah. Fever, sore throat, okay. What precautions should be taken for breastfeeding if the mother develops COVID? I think breastfeeding can be continued. Questions are disappearing. Yeah, I think that's all. I've answered all the questions.